Whenever you want.
Okay. So, oh, the meeting is being recorded, so we should all behave properly from now on. Okay, so I'm very happy to host this this session devoted to Bergson and architecture, basically. So you may recall that Schelling famously claimed that architecture is really frozen music. And I suppose Bergson may have said that it is frozen melody, or maybe the massive result of a tremendous slowing down of duration, a concretion of duration, sort of. The point is, he never said such a thing, just as he didn't speak much of architecture generally. So, except in one crucial instance, in the beginning of Time and Free Will. And the quote, I cannot resist quoting him on that, is, I believe, splendidly ambivalent. So here is how it goes. It's in the first pages. In architecture, Bergson writes, we find in the very midst of this startling immobility certain effects analogous to those of rhythm. The symmetry of form, the indefinite repetition of the same architectural motive, causes our faculty of perception to oscillate between the same and the same again, and gets rid of those customary incessant changes which in ordinary life bring us back without ceasing to the consciousness of our personality. Even the faint suggestion of an idea will then be enough to make the idea feel the whole mind. So I suppose our two speakers today will help us get our head around this interesting idea of the inherent rhythmicity of architecture, and also perhaps its somewhat hypnotic character. Our first speaker is Marc Rego. He was trained as an architect and has worked in several architectural practices, but I understand his main interests lay in the relationships between philosophy and architectural theory and practice. He's currently undergoing PhD research at the Mackintosh School of Architecture in Glasgow, that is the Glasgow School of Art. And the title of that research is Architecture of Time / Time in Architecture, Duration in Theory and Practice. The concept of duration seems central to his research, which has a special focus on the interconnections of Bergson's philosophy with architecture. And today, right now, he will present his views on duration in the ontology of Japanese architecture. I will present our second speaker, Thomas Michal, right after the first talk, if you allow me to do so. So please, Marc Rego, 20-30 minutes. It's your turn.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me present some of my work today. Hopefully you can see my screen. Right. So this presentation is a cross-disciplinary approach to the issues regarding the ontology of architecture. And I believe there's an affinity between many aspects of Bergson's philosophy and particularly Japanese traditions. This paper proposes to reflect on how this philosophy manifests in Japanese aesthetics, and I propose to analyze how architectural and aesthetic traditions in Japan interconnect with Bergson's philosophy and contribute to an alternative view on ontology. The main overview of my presentation will be the first part, some brief notes on Japanese aesthetic culture, followed by a case study of the Ise Jingo Shrine, and then some ramifications in Western architecture. So the idea of reality and change and transience is central to both Shinto and Buddhist philosophies, for whom impermanence is an essential feature of the world. Japanese traditions evidence a particular awareness of this worldview, which is central to its aesthetic culture and traditions. This awareness can be understood as a form of perception that focuses not only on the object, but also on the processes involved in its creation and duration. It is a sensibility evident in craftsmanship and how things are assembled or come together. They can be seen in the tectonic nature of things like wood joinery, folded layers of forged metal, or in the celebration of imperfections that arrive from the making of artifacts. The awareness of the transience of things reflects a profound expression of life itself and of the cycles of nature. We consider the lunar calendar, which reflected the agrarian society of traditional Japan, but also the imperfect and transient nature of the seasons. It marked the cycles of agricultural activities as well as life cycles of plants and animals. Therefore, each year the calendar was adjusted to reflect these natural cycles. The new year coincided with the beginning of the spring and the blooming of plum blossoms, the second month with cherry blossoms, and the third with the peach flower. Each year's calendar was adjusted and announced so that agricultural activities could be organized accordingly. The Gregorian calendar, adopted by Japan in 1873, is a rational and mathematical abstraction of planetary movements. While the lunar calendar reflected time according to the rhythms of life, the modern calendar measured time objectively. Japan's adaptation of the modern calendar means that now the new year starts in the middle of winter, or that June, named, and forgive my mispronunciation of any Japanese words, Minazuki, which means the month with no water, is in the middle of the rainy season. The contrast between these two calendars can be related to Bergson's critique of the spatialization of time. Bergson distinguishes between the homogeneity of space into which time is thrown in order to be measured and divided with the heterogeneity of lived experience. It is a distinction between the quantitative nature of a mathematical variable and the qualitative flow of the rhythms of life. The modern calendar imposes a rigid order of succession onto nature, which becomes dissynchronized with the natural movements of life. The traditional lunar calendar, in contrast, adjusted itself to the movements and rhythms of the natural world, drawing meaningfulness to time not as a measurement, but as the movement and experience of life itself. And I quote Bergson, he says, "There is no doubt but that for us, time is at first identical with the continuity of our inner life. What is this continuity? That of a flow or passage, but a self-sufficient flow or passage, the flow not implying a thing that flows, and the passing not proposing states through which we pass. The thing and the state are only artificially taking snapshots of the transition, and this transition, all that is naturally experienced, is duration itself." The relationship of the body and the cycles of life are also fundamental to Japanese culture, rituals, and aesthetics. Life, its creation, maturing, weathering, decay, renewal, and death, and the awareness of these durations in all things underline Japanese sensibilities. The sensibility contrasts with many Western traditions where the body can be characterized as a mechanical thing, where it is a tool or machine to be used serving a functional purpose. This mechanical view of the body reflects a meaning for life and death in modern Western culture. Life, as with time, becomes a commodity that can be gained, used, lost, or even sold. It has value, but it is a quantitative, mercantile value, where the qualitative heterogeneity of life is merely apparent. This modern scientific view of life also circumscribes the past, present, and future to strict, rigid boundaries, allowed to touch at points but never cut into each other. For Bergson, the past interpenetrates the present, and the present continuously gestures towards the horizon. This contrast can be extended to the ways we understand tradition. In the West, tradition is generally viewed as something from or contained in the past. It survives only through preservation. Analogous to embalming or taxidermy, where bodies are given a lifelike effect. In the East, tradition is alive. It reemerges, reinvents, and evolves in a creative way. It survives by being lived and performed. Tradition is a part of life, interpenetrating. In Japan, bodies have tangible and intangible attributes, eliciting that life is present even in the most ordinary objects, in their becoming, maturing, decay, renewal, and perishing. This particular awareness is probably best expressed by the phrase mono no aware. The literal translation means the pathos of things, which can also be understood as a deep feeling of things or the impermanence of things. The expression elicits a view of the world in which bodies are not static, but transient and unfolding in duration. An understanding that elicits a particular aesthetic feeling. The image on the left is Rembrandt's painting of the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. We can notice that none of the present are looking directly at the body, but instead are focusing their attention on the anatomical atlas in front of them. It is said that René Descartes was present at this lesson, which is significant considering the Cartesian view and the mathematical description of the body. On the right is a photograph of the exhibit Electric Labyrinth by the architect Arata Isozaki. The exhibit depicts Hokusai's ghostly ukiyo-e paintings of the, quoting Isozaki, the 9 stages of the process through which a beautiful woman decays after death, end quote. And these images are juxtaposed with the images of the human shadows that were etched in stone by the blast of the atomic bomb at Hiroshima. Isozaki notes that the images implied both the death and the rebirth of the sea. I think these two images reflect a deep dichotomy between the different views of the body within Eastern and Western traditions. And to quote, in the West, death becomes merely the production of waste material. Hospitals have already turned into processing facilities for industrial waste, which organ transplants serving as part of the recycling process. Anybody who senses something strange about this mechanical image will realize immediately that science in itself can never become culture. Under the pretext of positivism hides the absurdity of the scientist who turns on the lights in order to investigate the nature of darkness, end quote. The intangible has a profound effect on the understanding of matter. While Western cultures tend to ascribe a more physicalist view of the world, in Eastern traditions, the intangible is as much part of things as the physical particles that constitute them. In 1989, a short film titled Ma, Space-Time in the Garden of Yuanji was directed by artist, forgive my pronunciation, Takahiko Imura, in collaboration with the architect Arata Isozaki, depicts the concept of Ma. This film begins with the following text, I quote, Ma, a Japanese word, is a perception of space and time. It embodies the idea of space and time as one. Ma is reflected in many Japanese art forms and is fully realized in the garden of Yuanji, end quote. The artist Imura notes on the film, he said that in these films, I quote, in these films, I am interested in realizing Henry Bergson's concept of temporal duration, called durée. I see Bergson's durée as closer to the concept of time in the East, which regards time as duration rather than as divisible. If one regards the concept of Japanese Ma as an indivisible state of time and space, there is common ground with Bergson's durée. In the making of the film, I thought not merely of expressing the concept of Ma, but also of experiencing Ma. The slow tracking shots across immovable objects create a continuous space while making the viewer conscious of his and her own time process. End quote. Earlier at the Paris exhibit in 1978, an exhibit done by Isozaki, also titled Ma, Space-Time in Japan, he said, and I quote, "I wanted to present Ma in all its linguistic and non-linguistic, namely performative, aspects by evoking bodily experience through installations the onlooker might participate in, rather than to set forth a mere static concept." In the Yuajin stone garden, the apparent static stones can only be perceived through movement. They are never all immediately apparent to the viewer. Gunter Nietzsche suggests an association of Ma with place, where place is the product of lived space and lived time, a reflection of our states of mind and heart. This brief outline of Japanese traditions and aesthetic foundations reveals an inherent infinity with some of Bergson's philosophy. There are apparent sympathies with Bergson's De Re, the intangible and intangible, the discrete and qualitative, the homogeneous and heterogeneous. However, more astonishing is the sense of awareness central to Japanese sensibility and its relationship with Bergson's philosophical intuition. The sensible awareness equates to a kind of understanding or knowledge of the world and reality from within. Bergson distinguishes the two types of knowledge as relative knowledge based on mathematical and analytical abstractions, and absolute knowledge, which grasps things from the inside, which is attained by the method of intuition. At the very least, I think traditional Japanese sensibility and its aesthetic awareness are akin to Bergson's intuition of knowing and understanding things from the inside. Isojingo is one of Japan's most highly regarded Shinto shrines. The shrine complex is comprised by many structures. The most distinguished are two plots of land that sit side by side. On one side, the Goshuden enshrines the kami in the form of a mirror. On the other side, an empty lot of the same size and shape, the kodenchi. Many rituals take place at the shrine, and their calendar is defined by the cycles of rice cultivation. It is also one of the oldest shrines in Japan. According to some records, it could be 2,000 years old. Although one particular ritual, the Shikenen Sengu, makes the dating of the structure a complex issue. The ritual cyclically rebuilds the shrine every 20 years in the empty site next to it. In effect, every 20 years, the Goshuden and Kodenshi swap places. And I quote, curious philosophers and architects who look into the pairing of Goshuden to Kodenshi will find themselves rethinking the ontology of architecture. And in these drawings, we can see those two plots of land in the different spaces around them. This ritual presents some significant problems if used through the lens of Western thought. How can something be 2,000 years old if it's entirely rebuilt every 20 years? In standard ontology, buildings are material objects individuated as tables and chairs. Buildings are made of parts and come into existence when these parts are assembled. The well-known puzzle of the ship of Theseus illustrates the complexity and of the persistence of objects and part substitution. It is generally accepted that an object can survive the gradual replacement of some of its parts. It is controversial if it survives the gradual replacement of all parts. It is even more controversial and likely not accepted that an object can survive the simultaneous replacement of all parts. And furthermore, it is not compatible that an object can stand beside itself. And there is a moment in which the old shrine and the new shrine stand side by side. Therefore, according to Western ontology, the Issei Jingo cannot be more than 20 years old. The issue with this view is the same criticism Bergson makes about spatializing time. Time becomes subordinated to space, and things happen in a succession of intervals. Each iteration of the Issei Jingo is a distinct material object that exists only in distinct moments. However, the commonly accepted view and our own intuition tells us that the shrine is 2,000 years old. There is an alternative to the standard ontology, which might be an ontology of duration. In this alternative, the past and present coexist, they interpenetrate, which is distinct from the cadence of successive moments into which things come and go from existence. Duration is not bounded by mathematical division. Instead, it is a continuous multiplicity. It can reveal other durations and encompass them ad infinitum. And to quote Bergson, first in Time and Free Will, he says, "We can thus conceive of succession without distinction and think of it as a mutual penetration, an interconnection and organization of elements, each one of which represents the whole and cannot be distinguished or isolated from it except by abstract thought." End quote. And then in Duration and Simultaneity, he says, "When we are seated at the bank of a river, the flowing water, the gliding of a boat, or the flight of a bird, the ceaseless murmur in our life's deeps are for us three separate things, or only one, as we choose." End quote. A counter-argument is that the Issei Jingo could be considered a multi-instantiating object, similar to a work of literature or a piece of music. The same exact object or aesthetic experience is performed and repeated over and over. However, and although the current existing form of the Issei Jingo may resemble earlier ones, the ritual of rebuilding does allow for changes in material and spatial specifications, and such changes have occurred. Nevertheless, we do not consider the current form of the shrine as an error or impostor. It has simply evolved, continuously recreating itself anew. The architect Bruno Taut, in his praise of Issei Jingo, compared it to the Parthenon in Athens. And he said, I quote, "The shrine of Issei Jingo are Japan's greatest and most completely original creation in terms of world architecture. The Parthenon on the Acropolis is to the present day a visible sign of the beautiful gifts that men of Athens bestowed on their collective symbol of wisdom and intelligence, Athena. It is aesthetically the greatest and most sublime building in stone, as are the Issei shrines in wood. But still, there is a great difference. Even if the Parthenon had not been blown to ruins, it would today still be only a monument of ancient times, as life is missing from it. How very different are the shrines of Issei. Not only are the religious rites and the everlasting streams of worshippers a living presence, the shrines have yet another vital quality, which is entirely original in the effects, intention, and perception. This is the fact that the shrines are always new." And the image is actually an old postcard from 1910 of the shrines. There are further relations between the Issei Jingo and Bergson's philosophy, particularly if we look at the dichotomy between the Goshuden and the Kodenshi, the empty and the built sites. For Bergson, I quote, consciousness is both memory, the conservation and accumulation of the past in the present, and anticipation of the future, end quote. The contrast between the two halves of the Iso Jingo reveals this idea through aesthetic means. Each half cannot exist in isolation. The unbuilt site is as much a part of the whole as the built site. The Goshuden, through the continuous process of rebuilding, elicits the past into the present as a form of lived tradition. The Kodenshi, the unbuilt site, is the site of possibility. According to Bergson, possibility follows reality and does not precede it. It is put into the past retroactively after the fact. And I quote, as reality is created as something unforeseeable and new, its image is reflected behind it into the infinite past. Thus, it finds that it has form from all time been possible, but it is this precise moment that it begins to have been always possible. And that is why I said that its possibility, which does not precede its reality, will have preceded it once the reality has appeared. The possible is therefore the mirage of the present in the past. And as we know, the future will finally constitute a present, and the mirage effect is continuously being produced. We are convinced that the image of tomorrow is already contained in our actual present, which will be the past of tomorrow, although we did not manage to grasp it. And then he says, if we put the possible back into its proper place, evolution becomes something quite different from the realization of a program. The gates of the future open wide. Freedom is offered an unlimited field. The complexities of Issei Jingo speak to the nature of time we find in Bergson. It is the continuous exchange between the built and unbuilt, each side simultaneously eliciting the past, present, and future in a continuous and creative movement. The Kodenshi is the site of the past and simultaneously of the future. When we perceive it, we simultaneously recollect what is no longer present while evoking the possible because of the juxtaposition with the built by its side. It is a site that which is no longer present and of what has not yet arrived. The dichotomy between the Goshuden and the Kodenshi present both the virtual and the actual. However, either is entirely virtual or entirely actual. They are in constant flux, flowing and not static. I quote, perception and recollection always interpenetrate each other and are always exchanging something of their substance, as if by a process of an endosmosis, end quote. The coexistence and permeability of the past and present allow us to understand Iso Jingo in its entirety, and not as a succession of distinct moments, but as the intensity of life, continuously renewing, inventing, and projecting itself forward. And I quote again, our actual existence then, while is unrolled in time, duplicates itself all along with a virtual existence, a mirror image. Every moment of our life presents two aspects. It is actual and virtual, perception on the one side and memory on the other. Each moment is split up, and when it is posited, or rather, it consists in this very splitting of the present moment, always going forward, fleeting limit between the immediate past, which is now no more, and the immediate future, which is not yet, would be a mere abstraction were it not the moving mirror which continually reflects perception as memory, end quote. These rebuilding practices reveal a profound understanding of the ephemeral and transient nature of things. It reveals a sensibility and awareness of things are not solely defined by their tangible material qualities, but also existing in duration. These practices accept changes to the material and spatial specifications, which means that they are not just replicas of what was there before, but have evolved creatively. Lopez, in 2007, suggested that in order to overcome the paradox between the Iso Jingo, it should be considered as a token event, to which the corresponding type, I assume, would be the type Japanese architecture. This view is appealing. However, understanding things as events may still reduce time to space, and if such are considered as divisible and made up of successive intervals. Furthermore, this view ties us to a strong commitment between ontology and culture. Undoubtedly, culture and distinct forms of aesthetic culture. If these rebuilding practices and traditions were only circumscribed to Japanese culture, we would suggest that ontology is in fact contingent on it. However, they are not. We find equivalent practices also in Western architecture. We can find it in the rebuilding of the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe and Elie Reich. Built originally in 1929 and demolished in 1930, it was rebuilt in 1986 and still exists today. And we would not consider it two distinct pavilions. We can find other similar manifestations of these rebuilding practices, particularly in the works of rebuilding many monuments after the destruction caused by World War II. These examples seem to suggest that the ontology of architecture is not circumscribed to specific regions and cultural types. Furthermore, Japanese art and architecture are likely among the most influential expressions to permeate Western aesthetic sensibility, especially in the beginning of the century. We find these material and spatial sensibilities in the works of Frank Lloyd Wright or Charles René Mackintosh, and we can find the perception of Ma, the awareness of an indivisible state of time and space, at the Barcelona Pavilion, in as much it is found at the Joachim's Stone Garden. The question remains if we are dealing with distinct ontologies or a shared understanding of what architecture is. Bergson's contribution is that metaphysics is no longer confined to a closed system subordinated to scientific and mathematical logic alone. It becomes open and permeable to our sensibilities, expression, and experience of life. The images are of the Glasgow School of Art Library, which was sadly lost in a fire in 2008. And on the right is a study of a spatial experience through movement, comparing the Joachim Stone Garden and the Barcelona Pavilion. In the form of a small provocation, I would like to conclude my presentation with a quote from the architect Arata Isozaki. We may also, I quote, "We may also discover a Darwinist influence at work here." And Bruno Taut's reference to the Parthenon stood clearly within such a paradigm. In the tradition persisting since classicism, positing the Parthenon as a convenient standard for measuring architectural progress has become commonplace. For instance, the lithic column with its emphasis is said to preserve the trace of its having been made from a bundle of plants. This form then crystallized as a mass of stone, as an immutable emblem of progress, as well as a means of achieving timelessness. At Ise, transubstantiation is omitted. Instead, the rebuilding and relocation scheme of 20-year cycles embraces a biological model of regeneration. In order to preserve life, forms are generated and regenerated isomorphically. In their shared will to embody permanence, Ise and the Parthenon are alike, but the paths to attainment are opposed. Stone structures weather over time. Wooden structures are less characteristically able to withstand alterity, changes in social systems, and the style and taste of each age, yet better able to respond flexibly to the spirit of the age by way of naturally restorative and self-regulating impulse. End quote. I think this quote has a strong, elicits a relationship with Bergson's élan vital and a sort of biological view of architecture, perhaps. These are my references, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mark. So, this is very nice. Silent clapping of hands, since everyone is muted. And I understand that the idea is that we must save questions and answers for the end of our session. So thanks for this great talk, and I will directly move on to our next speaker, Thomas MICAL, a professor of architectural theory and head of the School of Art and Design at the Auckland University of Technology. He's a specialist of modern and hyper-modern theories of architecture and urbanism, with a special interest in hybrid knowledge systems, as well as philosophies of process, multiplicity and process. But also, I'm told, in surrealism, in both its historic, contemporary, and possibly future forms. He has taught many design studios around the world. He also leads a PhD program in spatial art in the Himalayas of India, of all places. Thomas MICAL told me he wrote his master at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and the subject was Tokyo. Tokyo and Blade Runner, or more generally sci-fi urbanism. He used mobile sections and sci-fi prototyping at the urban scale to make his point. I'm not sure how much his talk today is related to that previous work, but I'm really thrilled to hear him present his views on the relevance of Bergson's duration in architecture, and possibly also in film editing techniques. We'll see that. So the title of his talk is Intensity and Duration as Threshold Architectural Revolutions. Thank you. You have to unmute. Oh, there it is.
Got it. Thank you, Elie. Yeah, I'm working right now in very northern India, but obviously around the world quite a few times each day. I'm just going to jump right into the presentation. I have to preface this by saying I'm from Chicago and I talk pretty fast. All right, so let's just get rolling if we can. The topic is obviously around Bergson and duration, and it's been a significant part of my architecture education and wider work across the humanities for many decades. When I was working as a student at the European Graduate School, Wolfgang Schumacher asked me to take my architect's brain and apply it to the question of phenomenology. And I just blurted out without thinking, what if there were no objects? What if there were only intensities and durations? And I also offer that as a contrasting, I guess, statement, a proposition, when Elie was just channeling Bergson himself and said architecture is about the same and the same again. My project, I realized when you said that, was actually about the dissolving the architectonics of architecture to see what remains. So I'm going to try to illustrate this through a series of experiences and thought experiments in and around architectural works and works of late modern art. Again, it's a series of Bergson-inspired interrogations of forms of duration and intensity. I think that there's something to be said for these, bringing the lens of the psychic life and the later development of what is called psychic realism, to which surrealism contributed to a great degree, but not exclusively. Phenomenology is there, cognitive capitalism is there, and there's many other versions circulating around today around notions of consciousness and sense that keep coming back to these touchstones. It's almost as if there's an undercurrent in philosophy, psychology, psychoanalysis, and architectural theory, some of my preferred bases, or I should say oases, that has a very strong undercurrent, like a hidden river of Bersonian thought. And I don't hope to expose the entire river, but maybe show a few spring points. We want to think about the idea of the formless as identified by Bataille and celebrated in the work of Evelyn Bois and some of the other contemporary theorists of surrealism, that this idea of things that don't have form but are still recognizable as entities. Presupposing the idea of not just a spatial referent and one or more modes of seeing, something that avoids representation but can still be sensed and perceived, is actually a very fundamental challenge. And much forms of mechanical seeing and other forms of optical intelligence and mediated life has allowed us to see things that previously were naturalized or ignored. And again, you can find traces of that in Berson's writings everywhere from perception to the idea of duration as well. If we consider that those things, what is the smallest perceptible change between two things? Not in the sense of repetition and difference in the Deleuzian sense, but in a much more pragmatic, mechanistic, or visceral sense. You're looking at the back of Duchamp's large glass, if you know this photograph by Man Ray. And what Man Ray has captured in this photograph is the clearing, the partial clearing of the dust that is accumulated on this work of transparent modern art. What's also being articulated here is a sign system, almost like the NASA lines of pre-Columbian echo landscape work, or you can also see it in the trace, the detritus and the dust of which today nowadays has a rich theoretical basis to it, in the sense of not just cosmic dust, but the incredible value systems that come from the almost imperceptible. Duchamp's notion of the inference, which he said cannot be defined, but can only be described, is crucial for understanding architecture. Architecture can never prove a truth. It can only demonstrate cases. It's much closer to the origins of Renaissance medicine. We'll see an example, I think, of anatomy theaters, and that notion of demonstration of a particular instance that only later can be codified into a practice and never, never, never occupy the position of a science. We understand that the minimal perceptible interview, when augmented by technology, makes the world infinite. And you're looking at, obviously, again, to Duchamp, not the nude, descending the staircase with the cinematic gameplay that Mare initiated, of trying to catch that exact moment of a transformation. Nowadays, you've got not just motion capture theaters, but an entire range of CGI effects that I think many artists working in modernity through the optics of transparency, X-ray vision, hypothetical portals to other worlds, all of this rich range of things that the eye might be able to see or perceive, that also is felt through the bodies and through the nerve endings and articulates through the fingertips, whether we're drawing or touching keyboards. In many ways, all of these have minimal differences, minimal intervals, and increasingly that minimal interval is getting smaller and smaller and more valuable too. So our focus on the ideas of intensity and our focus on the ideas not of minimalism or even ultra minimalism, but the smallest perceptible unit, that least disturbance in the field that makes the world new again, is increasingly what I think is what architecture liberates, whereas historically it was used to suppress or to negate that. You can look for many examples of work, and I often go to Jean Tinguely's work, because one of my friends told me about this exhibition. He says, "You don't understand, these aren't just sculptures, these things move." And he was really terrified when he was telling me that. With the idea that this type of art that destroys itself, salvaged out of recycled materials, not as an upcycling to produce values, but as almost a subversion of the consumption and production model of desire and capitalism, being reinforced or reinterpreted into different types of almost operatic delamination of the floorboards of reality, of revealing what's beneath and between and behind the appearance of the world, and understanding that those creeping mechanisms themselves are just mechanisms that hide other mechanisms. For me, this kind of machinic intensity comes not from the actual pulleys and the levers, but from the psychological realization that these systems are presupposed on some systems and produce other systems. And there's an infinite proliferation of those if you're attentive to them, if you can perceive them, if you can find mechanisms to document, to record, or to even to poeticize them. When I was a young architecture student, we did a lot of work looking at that time Daniel Libeskind's explorations as he was moving from theory into building in Berlin in particular. And here you can see his attempt to use drafting techniques to capture that idea of Heraclitus, that you can never step into the same river twice. and how in this particular architectonic language, we get that idea of sensation, impulse, the tension of spaces. We have the idea of misalignments, mutations, and permutations, if not perforations of space. Space in this manner is something that is being dissected, opened up, revealed, and moved between, say, 1, 2, and 3 dimensions in some cases. As a process of that, space itself becomes malleable. People will be able to perceive through this type of representation what architects learn intuitively, that space is a raw material. It's not the building that is the architecture. All of the oxygen, all of the function, all of our dreams and ambitions happen from the paint inwards. It is the empty spaces, the voids, the plenums between things where architecture actually operates in terms of human life and activity. We also have to understand that architecture itself is a type of psychic structure. It is not simply real estate. One of my friends, Gavin Keeney, said, architecture without critique is real estate. But with the operations that happen in our mind and in our social relationships that come about from the operations in our mind, architecture can take on not just a multiplicity of values, but can actually mutate. Buildings, once properly understood and liberated from the domain of their function as smoothing machines and apparatuses of control, once you start to understand them in terms of their potentials and think about how people can modify not just their home and their environment, but even their point of view, once we start to understand that, buildings can become shapeshifters. And if our environment can be a shapeshifter, then we can be shapeshifters too. This is by Brian Cantley. It's a drawing, a mechanism, Los Angeles architect, showing the process of making, a modernist technique itself, where you do not hide the guidelines or the hidden rails used to produce a work, but you expose those as part of the process of making, a type of industrial craft. I want to talk about this idea also of intensity as something that can be accumulated and often be modified. The perception of intensities, the awareness of intensities. I think that architecture can function as psychic structures, and this has something to do with the psychic-like and psych realism, which is one of the reasons I've often done research in and around surrealism in cinema. Two of the, I guess, siblings of modern architecture. As a consequence of that, we also have to understand that there's imperceptible or sometimes intangible transformations that are happening in and around the environment all the time. If you look at the room that you're sitting in now, and many of you will have spent a lot of time in a similar room during the COVID lockdown, you'll notice subtle changes over time. And we saw some great examples of how that had been codified and aestheticized in Mark's previous presentation in Japanese aesthetics. The slow perception of the movement of the sun through a space. The most dynamic free material that architects have is sunlight, according to Lewis Kahn, but also the subtle perception of temperature gradient changes, pollen counts. All of that void between the walls is constantly in flux and in flow. It is alive, or at least lively, in its permutations, its machinations, and its ability to produce effects. And our ability to understand that and to work with it is a very powerful tool that architects are trained to do, not just in thinking three-dimensionally, but four-dimensionally. We can design projects, cities, environments, we can imagine other worlds, and we can make them tangible. I always tell architecture students that the first superpower they get is the ability to bend reality, something that you can see or imagine or sense. The redness of red, as Schlavsky said, Schlavsky was talking about the stoniness of stone. The redness of red is Merleau-Ponty. These fundamental aesthetic sensations, these moments of intensities can be unpacked, encoded, folded, turned into tomes and entire knowledge systems from one experience. Not even at the higher level of what Badiou would call an event, but perhaps most at the personal level of the encounter. And very often what we're encountering in the world is something that is not quite in the same time as us. In the examples of, say, revolutionary architecture of the French Revolution on the left, the ghost of geometries that are being created of absent centers or strong centers that influence the placement of every column. Those geometrical systems are psychological systems telling us what is important, even if it is invisible to us. If anything, that is the message of this architecture. On the right, you can see a beach in the Bahamas. The photograph tells us exactly where we are and that fleeting moment when the airplane is just taking off from the runway into the vast ocean. And we can see the affective nature of this space and of that moment. And through that photograph, we can all share in that same particular instance. This snaps us into a location. It puts us in a stationary subject position in 2-point perspective or 3-point perspective here. It places the airplane above us. And it presupposes a boundary condition, a threshold, two types of nature, oceanic and sand-based. And it also tells us there's an airport infrastructure behind us. So it's one instant that you can unpack into an entire world. And for me, that's something I've always found in Berson's work. We also, particularly now in a lot of design schools, cheat a lot. We will transcode or translate, perhaps liberated by late modernism, postmodernism, hypermodernism, the ability to take processes, remove or extract them, the opposite of gene splicing, from teleological or functional purposes, and insert them into other milieus, into other fabrics, into other situations. Here you're looking at a light emitting dress that also can present data, and also Korean photographer's work where he blends the body images and ceramics to transpose the different types of commodification that happen in contemporary luxury culture. Very quickly in time, I want to talk a little bit about durations, and particularly this idea about heterogeneous processes and the production of the new as something that we actually try, I believe, to accommodate to some degree. Architects often are trained to make things that are new and innovative, when often the best possible range of solutions come from attending to what is already present, what is absent, or increasingly cases of phantom limb phenomena. How can you produce effect at a distance, technologically or otherwise? We want to understand durations are entirely based on a certain set of perceptions, and they also have to do with not just animating time, but animating our resistance to time. In the same way you cannot rappel down a mountain or climb it without something being stable, duration would presuppose a stable subject for which duration would wash over or cover you or make you spin and dance and dissolve into a pure gesture. For this reason, I often will teach students, undergraduate, kindergarten actually through PhD, to think of buildings not as spaces with functions, but maybe to think of spaces as verbs. And each of these verbs operate as a pool in a bigger pool. And this is an idea that takes a little bit of work to grasp, but when you get that, pools of time are actually a very concrete example of the idea of multiplicity of duration. You look at Da Vinci's attempt to try to capture the turbulence of water, how incredibly elegant and how determined or over-determined by Renaissance geometries and Renaissance technologies this view of water is. You know, Heraclitus could not step into this water because he was operating in pre-Socratic Greece. It's not the same water for that reason. We can also think of this idea of the interiority of architecture and as a parallel structure, the psychic machinations and the structures of mind that we have, architectonic or otherwise, particularly in an era after liquid modernity. Everything is pulling us back to immersion, having immersive experiences, having education that is immersive, thinking about this possibility of always being inserted or inside or surrounded by things, as distinct from that very Renaissance notion of the object articulated as a body in space that comes with Quattrocento perspectival laws coming from Alberti and others. What we have nowadays is not even the giddiness of videos, but we have this constant sense of experiences washing over us, pulling us forward and capturing our memories of the past and inserting them into the present. So I find we actually live in a very Bersonian age, particularly the more we naturalize technologies and technologies of perception. They seem to have an incredible influence first on our dreams and then how we see the world when we wake up. I've done some work about looking at the ideas of soluble spaces, coming from a simple reading of André Breton's Poisson Soluble, one of his first novels about the soluble fish, to talk about how space itself, if we get away from thinking of it as commodity or something that's quantifiable or something that's a solid block of stone or sensation that will not change, its value comes from its flexibility, its adaptability, its impermanence. And here you're seeing a classic example of oil and water, two things that never mix, that create these rich, complex geometrical systems, which can now partially be mathematically modeled, which talk about a very particular type of, I guess, articulated indeterminacy. But the bubbling that comes from the boiling of the water and the oil produces a non-repeating, but in many ways, same and same again experience of space as something composed of other spaces, of worlds composed of other worlds. You can think of it also in terms of pools of time and other pools of time. And every drop of water, as we know, like a Hieronymus Bosch painting, contains ferocious monsters and unimaginable beasts and strange organisms, all of which live in our guts and keep our psychology stable. And so I think one of the fascinating things, I was telling one student that humans might just actually be deformed dolphins that carry the ocean inside them. And that we have to understand our world, not in terms of liquids, but that idea of movement, the turbulence. Even when I worked in New Zealand, Maori cosmology was very much based on climatic and oceanographic change, distribution of things, constant eddies and pools, all circulating around and around again, some regular, some irregular. So what does this have to do with architectural revolution? In the good old days, which is the high modernism I was taught by the master's disciples who were my studio professors, architectural revolution was the ability to create social change and radical social engineering through works mostly composed of concrete. We know nowadays that concrete itself and the removal of concrete from the architect's vocabulary would produce a very different and often more sustainable type of architecture. Le Corbusier famously backed off from the question of architecture and revolution, claiming revolution can be avoided, and trying to remove architecture from the political and the social, often I would suspect in the hopes of just getting commissions from all sides. But that's not the type of revolution I would prefer to talk about today. I would like to talk about, as Andre Breton talked about in The Surrealist, the revolution of the mind, and this ability to, as Breton said in the first manifesto, capture the real workings of the mind, the psychic life, and how that starts to come and appear to us in a variety of places in the world. Here you can see Georgia DeCuro's metaphysical painting. My colleague Neil Spiller's drawings, and you can see in the foreground some of the disquieting muses are now incorporated into these architectural representations as well. This ability for things to not just keep coming back, but to become operators. Architecture is one of those fields where the unbuilt works will have often more influence than the built works. The ghosts, the phantoms, the memories, the after images. Architecture, and sometimes particularly in architectural history classes, can be a cult of after images. In the theory of space itself is something that not only can be liquefied, but can be dissolved. On the left, you have from Stan Allen's essays from the late 90s, in the time of the advent of the information age, the movement from a modernist space, almost Mondrian-like in its pointillism or in its distribution of objects in a field, as a field condition, to, on the right, a diagram from chaos theory, where spaces themselves become composed of multiple phases, strange attractors. The mathematics and geometry of chaos theory ties in very closely to some of the hypothetical poetics of some of the earlier work in surrealism and phenomenology, where space itself becomes untethered from its physical constraints, but again, with strange attractors and influencing machines being the dominant psychological models, architecture starts to produce effects in us, around us, and for us at great distance, as well as in proximity. I've been working with a program here up in northern India. I call it, for this slide, fuzzy logic, but trying to build transdisciplinary relationships between nomad science, remote intensities, and pataphysical equipment. And that's another project I can talk about at another time. But my moral for the students is to seek remote intensities, to put yourself in motion in the world. Nomadic in science and the search for knowledge systems, pools of experiences, different forms of unimagined environments, limited severely by the pandemic and the lockdown, hasn't limited our ability to find those things. And so the point of the doctoral program that I run is for the students to seek remote intensities like nomads. And nomads don't visit a place once and extract. Nomads circuit. Nomads connect and link things in the world that are dissimilar and make them into an entirely new world in itself, composed of vectors, movement systems, and a type of mobile subjectivity. It's very different than archival-based research. So I'm always asking them to seek remote intensities. Architecture, and this is a former friend of mine, Livius Woods. I remember him chain smoking once and telling me this. He said, I don't actually care about buildings anymore. Buildings are just built ideas. And that's when I told him about the idea that there just might be psychic structures. He said, you might be onto something there. Spaces of knowing and locations of intensities of knowledge. Some can be formatted and formal, others have to be extracted, and that's a dangerous thing to do, but perceived and in some ways cherished is probably a more healthy model for scholars and researchers and designers to do. I'm very fond of having students work through these ideas, not solely through philosophy. I'm famous for throwing philosophy at students as well as diagrams and asking them to reconcile them. Those are my two favorite tools. Strangely, I did my dissertation on Nietzsche's theory of eternal recurrence. So temporality has always been a concern of mine in relationship to spatial constructs. But here you can see, I like boys, but a lot of people like boys. And his experiment with the fat corner and his critique of institutional studio culture was a very strong inspiration for me when I was a studio professor. My approach towards architectural theory has always been to, test, prototype, identify, articulate, then mutate concepts in the same way geologists might start to describe or define different strata of the earth. We look for concepts and we work with them and then we modify them. And we think about space itself as having qualities of intensity, intensive orders, intensification. Perhaps growing through but beyond Henri Lefebvre's notion of conceived, perceived, and lived space, spatial intensity, intensification is often something that is best done in field conditions and experiments. I mentioned before in higher education, we have to demonstrate, we cannot prove. And one of the first experiences I had, my first day as a baby professor, I was appointed at the Mies van der Rohe Crown Hall Institute, Illinois Institute of Technology, School of Architecture, to teach something called the History of Modern Thought in Architecture. They said, whatever you do, don't teach theory. And I said, why not? And they said, the architects will go after you. You have to not use the word theory, and you have to teach modern architectural theory without using any of those words. So I taught the history of modern thought, which is using 24 different contemporary 20th century philosophers from Merleau-Ponty through Wittgenstein to Badiou, analyzing the same column in the building each week using a different philosophical system. And just in closing, we're starting to do some work on thinking about not just intensities as something between media, spectacles, events, and experiences, but also those that in some ways resist, are unreproducible, but produce effects. Utopian intensities, as you can see in this case, the making of Brasilia. The low-res version, that's Ant Farm's Drop City, a temporary transitive utopia. Constance's New Babylon is an intensive ordering for the production of the possible opening up of freedom. One of my favorite Viennese firms, the technical revolutionary architecture of Haus Rucker in their early days. You can see they just created an observation point in Vienna that actually blocks off all the traffic in Vienna. And the place that I wrote most of my PhD dissertation, sitting in the Tiergarten, watching the Love Parade go by and thinking there's something here that is much more interesting than studying Schinkel's architecture. I wonder what it is. I'm going to close at that point. I'm a little conscious of time. That's a book series I've started, and that's the poster for our doctoral program. And I will stop advertising at that point and hand the mic back for that quasi-autobiographical investigation of some ideas I've learned from Bergson. Thank you.
Thank you. So, silent clapping. Thanks a lot, Thomas. That was a very stimulating and suggestive survey of your fields of inquiry. I should say it in the plural. So it's a very rich content we have here, both Mark and Thomas, and I suppose we should launch a general discussion, but maybe in order to gear things a little bit, I will first come back to Mark's presentation, ask him a question, then another question for Thomas, and then we'll all open our mics in turn, of course. So, yes, my first question regarding Mark Rego's presentation concerns the way the idea of continuous space was introduced in several places, and the notion that the Japanese architecture and the traditional discourse and practice of Japanese architecture puts an emphasis on the concrete nature of place as opposed to abstract homogeneous space, on the dynamic character of spatial design as opposed to static geometric conceptions. But in the examples you gave when you were referring to the Ma concept, I was struck by the fact that most of these structures, including the Rio Anji, really are not so continuous as it may seem from what you were saying. And in fact, although duration itself is, or the experience of space itself may be indivisible in some sense, maybe in Bergson's sense, I had also the strong feeling that there is a rhythmic quality, to come back to that notion of rhythm, which was strangely absent from both presentations. I mean, it was not in the foreground, let's say. There's a rhythmic quality that has to do with the way, and I'm thinking here of the Japanese structure of traditional houses. The space comes in sequences. There's a system of thresholds which cut out and mark off space in a way which introduces some sort of rhythmic principle of segmentation. And so, which makes it a little hard for me to understand how the idea of continuity is reintroduced. So, how does it operate at which level? Is it at the level of the sheer temporal experience of someone walking around the space, or what? Because in terms of spatial structure, the Ma as spacing out of place seems to introduce a measure of discontinuity. In fact, just like rhythm in its own way. So how would you respond to that?
Yes, I think both in architecture and in the Yuanji stone garden, there's obviously elements that are not moving. But I think particularly the concept of Ma in the stone garden, it's not as much about the stones itself, but the space between the stones. And I think the relationship between the stone garden and architecture is that to fully understand architecture is not just to understand it from the material perspective, but from the experience of it. And even in Japanese traditional houses, I think or Japanese architecture in general had a major influence on modern or proto-modern architects. If we look at, for example, the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, where he begins to introduce the sort of open plan, where things aren't really defined, and the functions of spaces, those boundaries are a bit more blurred. That sort of spatial experience, I think, there's a lot of it that is influenced from Japanese aesthetics and tradition. So I think, although architecture, yes, might seem as the most concrete thing that we can look at, but without the experience of the space, we're only seeing half the picture. So.
Right, but even in terms of experience, the idea of Ma in French, and I suppose in English too, is sometimes translated as interval. So again, this notion of spacing out, which reintroduces some sense of boundary or space, or drawing limits in some sense, or you could push out limits and space out, but spacing out reintroduces a notion of a fluidity which is predicated upon a kind of structural segmentation of space. So that was my point. I mean,
yeah, I think an interesting word perhaps to translate instead of interval is the sort of the interstitial,
right?
Which is not so much a boundary between things, but it's the movement between them.
Interesting.
So I felt it more that way.
Okay, that was one question for the first speaker, and now my concern is symmetry. Our second speaker also deserved an initial question, and so again, your survey was very rich, and we had a dizzying tour of several motives, which each would deserve a discussion in its own right. So from the infratheme to phantom intensity through pools of time, and many fascinating motives there. My question, I suppose, has to do with the realization that most of those motifs are in fact inherently spatial in nature. I mean, we had like pictures of them. They had a very graphic kind of conspicuousness, and yes, even smooth space ultimately is a way to restructure space. And then so I understand that most of those figures were meant to go beyond the purely visual, or let's say perspectival formatting of the perceptual field, in order to reintroduce new levels of intensity, new modes of intensity. But basically, these are spatial constructs. This is spatial design, which makes sense since we're dealing with architecture. But then my question for you is: so how do you how does time operates? And so Mark's examples of the Ise temple, the Ise shrine, is of course prototypical, and I was wondering what for you in your own experience would play such a role, such a theoretical role as a figure of the temporal. A temporal vector within architecture. I mean, beyond the dynamic space which you introduced, what would count in your sense as the prototypical temporal experience of built architecture? So you mentioned Mies van der Rohe and several other icons, but so
when I was starting off teaching in Crown Hall, one of the things that in Fritz Neumeyer's book on Mies, he had an index card from a Mies speech where Mies said, "I've learned the most from old buildings." And in many cases, particularly that building, as Kenneth Frampton argued, Mies had moved from his avant-garde activities in Berlin to a kind of new classicism, a neoclassicism in Crown Hall and all of his American work, with the development of these long span structures, so he could keep all of the exoskeletons on the outside. The Crown Hall, besides being a terrifying aquarium for growing architects as a paranoia-inducing environment, is attempting to stop time, to arrest time entirely. Even by frosting the windows, you can't notice the permutations. You only know light and dark. You don't see the movement of the sun. So there's something in that ultra minimalism that seeks to stop or congeal time in the most minimalist of modern architecture, in the cases of the Mies buildings I've lived and worked in Berlin and Chicago. Simultaneous with that is that childlike sense of wonder that all of us had, and many of us will have lost through higher education. And thank God there's artists and filmmakers and poets to bring it back to us. Because one of the things that happens also is that intensification when you get overloaded. I don't know if people do this, but I will sometimes go off into a daydream when I see something very powerful or poetic or unexpected. And maybe that makes me a surrealist. Maybe I have attention deficit disorder. Maybe I'm just allowing the duration to occur and stop worrying about the metrical time, as Mumford called it, the monastic clock orientation of the world, that, we need a clockwork universe and the clock must function. And Bergson was the first I read I was like, that makes sense, that spaces are like lava or liquids. They're molten flows of experience. And living in New Zealand, the lava can move quite slowly, and it can also just explode and create the new volcano in one day too. So understanding that volatility and the time itself, and I'll use a oversimplified answer to that too. When I was a little architecture student back before the internet, we had to draw everything two-dimensionally, then construct it three-dimensionally, then build a model, and then we would move the lamps or do other things to try to animate it. Nowadays, the students, before they even come to school, have already worked with Minecraft, where things not only have an XYZ coordinate, but there's a temporal component in most software for everything, right? And so in some ways, time has overtaken our spatial logic, and the intensification of that responsibility to time and our students' misbelief that they can multitask better in each of those pools of time simultaneously than one. That sounds reactionary, but what it does is it creates, in many cases, such multiple proliferations of parallel or nearly similar worlds, we wind up again with these recurring, gardens of unearthly delight created from our own imaginations. Let's try to do one thing and then it takes us other places. So that nonlinear component, and that's a phrase I was obsessed with for a long time. What is nonlinear warfare? What is nonlinear marketing? What is nonlinear causality? Those are things that I kept finding archival evidence in surrealism and phenomenology, even in the writings of Vico in some places, going way back and saying, where is this idea that you can live in 3 time-space conditions simultaneously? Where can I become a chimera and not simply be, a human or a dolphin? And so for me, the temporality question is always something that's been attendant and easier to access through the spatial logic.
Right.
We can't get students to talk about architecture, particularly with plans. They think it's a terrifying boutique language like wines that only experts speak, but you show them a film clip and you can't shut them up. And so in some ways, the temporality and the movement of all these dead images at 24 or 48 frames per second creates a appearance of movement. And so for me, cinema, in a very different way, obviously, than Deleuze and Bergson, for me, cinema was the gateway drug to architecture. It allowed us to start to understand that spaces don't even, exist until they start to change. And it's only when you can perceive them changing, when you see the sunlight here changing, when autumn comes and the shadows become more blue, and you can't prove it, but
Right.
That for me was the moment that time snuck back into the spatial. But I always use images to explain concepts, because using one or the other, I feel like half the audience won't understand what I'm saying.
Well, thank you. That was great. And I suppose there's one motive that is circulating in both presentations. I think, although it was not mentioned as such, is the idea of maybe non-linearity, or more generally action at a distance. Thinking back to about Elie, the idea of a translocal or transspatial presence, and also trans-temporal in some sense. The idea that time, just as space, does not unfold from place to place, one instant after the other, but in some sense jumps around. So let's open the floor for discussion and further questions. I see that Yasushi has a question for whom exactly?
Maybe Margarita is already
okay.
before me.
Yeah.
He.
I didn't see any raised hands, but okay, Margarita.
I
have a question.
Okay.
In chat, yes.
I think there's a function there that you could activate a hand that shows on your image. But so where should we start? Who is first? I'm not sure now. So Margarita, let's start with Margarita, and then we'll have okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Yasushi was first, but since he kindly gave me his place, this is a question for Professor Michal. It's about the relationship between the perceptual unit, the smallest perceptual unit, and intensity in the Bergsonian sense, because it seems to me that it's a very kind of fertile field, in the sense that I can recognize 3 relationships already, but I would like to hear what Professor Michal had in mind, because it seems to me that, for example, in the first work of Bergson, Time and Free Will, the essay on the immediate date of consciousness, intensity is related to the perception of change, and then and also what happens really when we perceive something as a change of state. And then in Matter and Memory, there is a part where he says about the difference between our perception and matter as it is in itself. And he says that there's always a kind of contraction of the movements of matter, that there can be, for example, the color red, it can be trillion movements that our perception contracts in the color red in an instant, let's say. And this depends on the intensity of our lives, the intensity of each living being. So, I mean, I had this idea in mind, but I wanted to ask you really how they are related in your understanding.
Yeah, I think the relationship would probably also be somewhat, I would say, human-centered and spatial, as opposed to post-human. And maybe dancing is a closer metaphor than anything machinic, particularly if it's a dance of two things. But that's a poetic metaphor as well. Let me see if I can attack it with my architect's brain and unpack this in a way that makes sense, because the interest that I had, and you can study surrealism, and there'll always be research to be done on surrealism as one of the few avant-garde movements that didn't actually register in architecture, as I and a few others have published about, and not in the way that, say, the Bauhaus or even Futurism had a significant influence on architecture. As a consequence, many of the things that the surrealists were trying to examine, and in some ways also phenomenology, have nowadays perhaps more of a natural home in cognitive science, as we know, or in other forms of philosophy or ethics, I would argue. But people have done research on everything from sexuality to politics to the occult, and find rich evidence in surrealism. Surrealism in many ways is a fascinating, I guess, antique shop of unfinished thoughts. And for that reason, much of the work that I started to be attracted to came from a design studio I taught once in upstate New York. After visiting Prague for the first time, I came back and I taught a design studio whose entire studio brief was just one question. You can't do that now because you've got to morselize learning outcomes and, list the schedule and the readings. But back in the wild days when you could just hand out, I taught a studio called "What in Architecture Cannot Be Photographed?" And the students were in agony for weeks because they had learned architecture. And this also answers Eli's earlier question. They had learned architecture through photography. I was at a psychoanalytics conference and they said, the conference was called "What Do Buildings Want?" after W.J.T. Mitchell's "What Do Images Want?" And the answer from all the experts was buildings want to be photographed. But when they're photographed, there's no humans in them. And they're like fresh out of the box, oven fresh, uncontaminated by reality. And for me, reality was always that, fascinating discrepancy between any sort of romantic idealism, which allows you to see the world, or at least us to see the world, those my friends, and all of the malfunctions that actually become more wondrous because they're malfunctions. And so I don't want to call them contaminants, but surrealism, and particularly the work that Bataille and others did on the formless in Bois, and Rosalind Krauss, and a lot of the early theorists of American academic studies of surrealism pointed out these conditions of near indeterminacy, that kind of, not disappearance, but almost disappearance, and everything from, phenomenologies of blurred images into registrations of ephemeral works of art, and, the abuse of the word liminal throughout all of the visual arts for a decade. Many of this was concerned, I think, with the ability that, once photography allowed us to see different types of blurs, or the color violet became known in the visible spectrum once there was a word for that particular pigment, which used to be royal blue. It's almost like the technologies and the terminologies, and this is a linguistic argument, allows us to see things we didn't see before. And mechanized seeing, following the ideas from Crary to Virilio, taught us an entire range of things, from Benjamin's optical unconscious to now our selfie obsessed generations of people that only exist through their selfies. This idea increasingly haunted me because it's the one thing that was never taught in architecture school. Architecture was supposed to respond like, I think it was Percy Bysshe Shelley who said that every poem is a continuation of the same poem, or all great poetry is a continuation of the same poem. And we were expected to operate in an epic and monumental way in our training as second generation modernists. And yet, when I was reading Lefebvre, this idea of, lived space, that you only notice through habitas the changes in your daily routine. So for me, it was actually a failure of the architecture education to explain why all of these, oddities, these barely perceptible phenomena, were so significant to people. And particularly, we didn't know how to draw them. There wasn't a formal language for moving beyond object, void, inside, outside. And so it was only in the early digital age that those questions started to be asked, and the new tools allowed us to start to try to represent and to make perceptible the imperceptible, to oversimplify.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions and less than 5 minutes in principle. So this is
Mark, you got the next one.
That's a challenge. So we have Mr. Sato Zervali.
Yeah.
You want to ask a question?
architecture is a great field which combines ideas and objects and visuality. So it is, but the challenge for in Bergsonian sense for architecture is combination of indivisible time and divisible space together in one idea, one creativity. My question is a continuation of Elie's question to Mark. I mean, this continuity, is it, I mean, in Japanese architecture, is it like simplicity or like empty space, which shows also the time duration within the activities done in spaces? Like, for example, the Japanese tea ceremony. The long duration of the activity and also the simplicity around makes you feel like in a long duration, long continuation, even you are in a space, you are in a, I don't know if Mark can give this kind of ceremonial things and the simplicity of the around in space could be one Bergsonian idea in Japanese architecture. And my question to Thomas, I mean, building ideas from building is a good move, but building changes and building becomings, building flows are also could be the maybe the nexus of Bergsonian thought. I wonder if this recent kind of like moving buildings in modern architecture, postmodern architecture, they have some sort of maybe like ideas of Bergsonism to be shown to the world, like how building they can be also fluid, how building they can be also part of living. This is maybe in architecture could be another movement and could be linked to Bergsonism. This is my question. Thank you to both speakers.
So, and a quick answer because we have two more questions coming.
Okay. I'll give one anecdote in that case. I have a colleague who's designed houses in Australia, and he designed it so that multi-generational houses, like cultures that plant a tree that only the grandchildren will experience, designed a house that could be for a young couple, then accommodate growth and change for children. And then the children will move out and it modifies itself again. And then as the people retire and need someone to move in and help them, or they can sublet part of it. So taking this idea of multi-general or phases of life and codifying that as the timeline for the house, as opposed to this is the kitchen, this is the bathroom. But I'm just trying to show perceptual models influenced by surrealism that do not yet have a codified language in architecture to represent them consistently.
Mark, you wanted to respond to that too?
Sure. Perhaps very quickly, I think the idea of the rituals and the functions that are performed in different spaces, I think they have their own duration. What I think is interesting about analyzing Bergson just opposed to architecture is that the duration of the space and the architecture itself and our own inner durations, when we experience that space, start to become sort of intermingled and interpenetrate each other. So I think that idea of the ritual, for example, the tea ceremony, I think that's a good example of that, that we feel it as something slow and prolonged, not only because of the space, but also because of our inner time. Hope that's the answer.
So I suppose the next question is from Yasushi, and then we'll have Hisashi Fujita talk.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is to Mark, and thank you very much for your talk, great talk, and very suggestive. As it always makes me think, feel unsettled when I ask if Bergsonian dichotomy, that is heterogeneous and homogeneous time, or dynamic and static, and would perfectly fit to when we think about Japanese architecture, because so thank you for taking the Isejingu's case. It is very interesting. But in that case, so the kodenchi is also said called as shinmishikichi. This is old at the same time new. So in that case, the temporality is more like a repetitive, more rather than dynamical, and the accumulation of the past. Not something like that. Rather, it is more mathematical, as so as to speak, or more abstract. And so in that case, so how do you think? So when you connect the Bergsonian philosophy to the idea of temporality we see in Japanese architecture, in my view, if I need to try to find something correspond to Bergsonian philosophy, it would be pure memory theory rather than duration in respect to the notion of repetition, or more like repetition gives something. So it questions about the numerical identity itself, the notion of numerical identity. So this phase is, I think it provokes very stimulating ideas, but I have no answer. So if you have any suggestions, that would be welcome. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think I don't know if I have a good answer, but I think your suggestions are accurate. And I don't think it's only Bergson's duration that is relevant for architecture. I do think his ideas on memory and matter are also very important, if not more. I think the example of the kodenchi, of the empty site, looking at it as sort of just purely as repetition, even in duration, I think one of the things is that the shrine is not always built in the same way. And historically, both the shrine, the compound has changed shape. I think originally it used to be more square. Even the fencing around it, I've read that nowadays the views are more obstructed. It used to be more open before. So what I think is interesting about the kodenchi is sort of this, the idea that when Bergson talks about possibility, that it's sort of, when we view that space, it is sort of a memory of the old shrine that used to be there, but it is also a place of the future shrine simultaneously. So there's sort of this virtual shrine that's there that will only be possible after it's built. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think there's many ramifications of Bergson's philosophy that I think interconnect architecture, and that are very interesting questions to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the concluding questions will be from Hisashi Fujita.
Okay, thank you very much. I really enjoyed both papers. I love the architecture, so I really enjoyed hearing the name of Mies van der Rohe or Daniel Libeskind. It was very good, very nice. So my question concerns to the first paper, to Max Rego. So I have one question and one comment. For one comment concerns Ise Jingu, for Shikinen Sengu. I go into the same direction to Yasushi, and perhaps so it's a cycle and it's a metabolism. So perhaps kodenchi and shikichi, so new and old, building and destruction. So okay, but perhaps if you pay attention to the small modifications in one building to another building, perhaps it has many differences, but still you pay attention to the same identity, numerical identity. So I think we must pay attention to this identity and the difference. So certain, how to say, perhaps it's like a rhythmicity, perhaps. And another thing for this comment, Shikinen Sengu is supposed sustained by the government, by the political power. It's not a natural biographical metabolism. So it's a very highly artificially constructed, you know. So I think it's a different thing than Ryoanji case. So for Ryoanji case, I have a question. You have underlined the notion of ma. And this notion corresponds to the duration, yes, but in a condition of interpreting the duration as a certain measurement. I say measurement, because ma is not a natural thing. Ma is highly calculated, you know. So both it's a natural and how to say artificial. And it's artificial, but how to say highly artificial than the artificiality. So it's near to nature. You know, I think the duration is a Bergson way of measuring the time more than the, how to say, mathematical measurement. So it's a way of measurement of time duration for Bergson, I think. So perhaps Elie During has underlined at the beginning of this session the notion of rhythmicity. I think he's correct. And for me, the rhythmicity is a problem of both, how to say, natural duration and calculation. So it's not separated from the time problem of space. So how you can interpret this notion of ma in terms of duration, but not only in terms of how to say natural duration, but also artificial and symbolical separation. Yes, it's my question.
Okay. Yeah, I agree that ma is not sort of a natural phenomenon. It's something that is can be artificial or perhaps created. I think there is a relationship to the rhythm and the placement, for example, in the stone garden of where those stones are put. But for example, one of the images I showed was a diagram that showed sort of the line views of the garden from different positions, sort of alluding to that to understand the garden is not just a snapshot, but it is sort of the movement through the space that we are able to accumulate that experience. And I think ma is important, at least the way I understood it, which forgive me if it's not accurate, but I was thinking about this idea of the interstitial. So not so much as a linear interval between one thing and the next, but the movement between those two things. For example, the image that I showed from Isozaki's exhibit, the Electric Labyrinth, he just opposes different notions of the body, but also it's sort of an exhibit that you have to meander through it to understand the implications that he is suggesting with those juxtapositions. So it's sort of that sort of interstitial between one image and the next, and the accumulation of that experience that I think gives you a complete picture of that work of art or work of architecture and so forth. I don't know if that answers completely your question, but I hope it does. In regards to the Iso Jingo, I know it is subsidized by the government, but it's also not unique. There's many shrines in Japan that are rebuilt. Some are rebuilt in similar ways, in fully rebuilt. Some are gradually replaced and rebuilt. So I think the Ise Shrine is a paradigm example, but I don't think it's isolated. I think there's many repercussions in other examples and other types of architecture.
Okay, so in about 1 hour there will be another session about space and time, but this time in connection with Einstein's space-time theory and Bergson's relation to it. I suggest we wrap up by a brief comment by Thomas, if he likes.
Yeah, I think it's been quite helpful and interesting for me to also have this opportunity to, I guess, articulate some interests in and around the topics here. And it's always a pleasure to step out of the discipline of architecture. And when I'm brave enough to go to philosophy conferences, it always feels like a dissertation exam for the questioning period. So I'm very grateful for all of those anxieties that have come back too. Thank you all.
Well, thank you all for a very insightful exchange and discussion. And hopefully we'll see you this afternoon. I mean, for me, it's going to be the afternoon. I don't know for you.